All right, let's jump into another deep dive. Today we're looking at a problem that probably everyone who's run Windows virtual machines on Proxmox has run into.
Oh, I know this one.
Yeah, you know it, I know it, everybody knows it. Slow network speeds.
Ugh, so frustrating.
You got your awesome home server set up,
Right.
maybe running applications like Jellyfin, but the performance
Just not there.
just isn't there. So don't worry, you don't have to be some networking guru.
Please, no.
No, we're going to break down this guide that offers some really, really simple fixes
Hopefully simple.
that could make a world of difference. Hopefully they're simple.
Fingers crossed. I think one thing that people overlook is that before you jump into solutions, you got to confirm that you're actually dealing with a network problem.
Oh, good point.
Yeah, it might seem obvious, but, you know.
It's like, is it plugged in?
Right.
Okay, so how do we do that?
Well, a good starting point is a simple file transfer.
Okay.
Try moving a large file between your VM and the host machine. If that's really slow, that's a good indicator.
Right.
If you want more precise measurements, there are tools,
Oh, okay.
like iPerf, to test the network speed directly.
Okay, cool. So we confirm, all right, it's definitely the network that's slowing things down. What next?
So the guide here, the first thing it mentions is these things called VirtIO drivers.
VirtIO, okay. What are they?
They're special drivers for virtual environments.
Okay.
They can really make a difference for your network performance.
Interesting.
When you install Windows in a VM, it often defaults to just generic network drivers.
Okay, yeah, makes sense.
They work, but they're not optimized for virtualization.
Right. It's like they're doing their best.
It's like trying to run a high-performance car on, regular fuel.
Oh, okay.
It'll move, but you're not getting the full potential.
You're not getting that zoom.
Yeah.
So these VirtIO drivers are like high-octane fuel.
That's a great way to put it. They reduce the CPU overhead that's required to manage the virtual network.
Sure.
That frees up resources and lets the VM talk to the network much more efficiently.
So how do we switch over to these high-octane, high-performance drivers?
It's actually really easy. Proxmox makes it super straightforward. You just download this VirtIO drivers ISO from the website,
Okay.
attach it to your VM, and install them through the Windows Device Manager.
Easy peasy?
Reboot, and you're good to go.
That does sound pretty easy. All right, so say we do that, we install these VirtIO drivers, but we're still not seeing the speeds that we hoped for.
Right. What else could it be?
Is there anything else we should be checking?
Well, even with the right drivers, the way your virtual network adapter is configured can still affect performance.
The adapter itself, okay.
Yeah, Proxmox, it often defaults to using this older model. It's called the E1000.
All right, so what do we want?
You want VirtIO,
Oh, okay.
which is specifically designed for these high-speed virtual environments.
Okay.
If you look in your VM config file, you'll see a line. It'll say like net0.virtio. That's how you know you've got it. And while you're in there, you should also enable multiple queues.
Multiple queues, okay. What do those do?
Imagine like adding more lanes to a highway.
Okay.
It just lets the VM process that network traffic more efficiently,
Makes sense.
especially on multi-core systems.
Okay, so we've got the right drivers, we've got the right adapter settings, we've enabled multiple queues. What else? What about the Proxmox firewall? Could that be causing problems?
Yeah, so firewalls, they're essential for security,
Sure.
but sometimes a misconfigured firewall can actually throttle your network speed without you realizing it.
Right, it's trying to protect you, but
It's like overprotective parents.
yeah, too overprotecting.
So a simple test is to just temporarily disable the Proxmox firewall for the VM.
Okay.
And if you do that and suddenly everything speeds up,
We found the culprit,
you know you found the problem.
but we can't just leave the firewall off, right?
I know, of course not.
That's not a good long-term solution.
But you can create specific firewall rules that'll allow the traffic you need while still keeping your system secure.
Right, so we can have both.
It might take a little bit of tweaking, but it's worth it for the peace of mind.
Okay, so we've got the drivers, the adapter settings, the firewall. That seems like all the bases. But this guide also mentions that sometimes it's not even the network that's the problem. It's the resources available to the VM.
You can have the fastest network in the world, but if your VM is starving,
It's not going to go anywhere.
it's going to struggle. Imagine trying to stream 4K video
Uh-oh.
on a computer that can barely run a web browser.
Yeah, that's not going to be a good experience.
Yeah, it's going to be laggy, buffering nightmares.
The worst. So what do we do?
Make sure your VM has enough CPU cores and RAM.
Makes sense.
Check the Proxmox settings and make sure it's not overcommitting resources.
Right, so we're not starving any of the other VMs.
Yeah, you want to give it enough room to breathe, but not so much that it hogs everything.
That sweet spot. Yeah, it's always about finding that balance. Now, there's this one thing I saw mentioned in the guide that I'm not familiar with, UMA.
NUM.
Yeah. What is that?
NUMA stands for non-uniform memory access.
Non-uniform memory access. Okay.
It's a little technical, but basically it's about how your VM's virtual CPUs access the physical RAM on your server.
All right, so we're getting into the weeds a bit here. Should we dive deeper on that one or save it for later?
Maybe we can save that for later when we have a little more time to dig in.
Yeah, because I have a feeling that's a whole topic in itself.
It's a rabbit hole for sure.
But for now, it sounds like if you've got a system with a lot of cores, it's something to look into.
Definitely.
All right, so we've covered a lot. Drivers, adapters, firewalls, resource allocation. But this guide throws in a bit of a curveball. Sometimes slow network speeds aren't even a network problem. It's the disk.
Oh, the sneaky disk bottleneck.
Yeah, the hidden culprit.
It's easy to fixate on the network,
Right.
but sometimes the VM's hard drive, it's just struggling to keep up.
Okay, so how do we know if that's the problem? What are we looking for?
A couple things. First, make sure you're using the right disk cache mode.
Okay.
Write back is usually the best for performance in a virtual environment.
Right back, got it.
Also, enable this thing called IO thread in the VM's configuration.
IO thread, what's that?
It basically enables parallel processing for disk operations.
Okay, so it's multitasking.
Exactly. Can really speed things up, especially if you're working with lots of small files.
All right, so we've got the right cache mode, IO thread is enabled. Anything else?
This might seem obvious, but using an SSD for your VM storage can make a huge difference.
Yeah, SSDs, they're just so much faster.
So much faster.
Yeah. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground already. We've looked at drivers, adapters, firewalls, even resource allocation, and those sneaky disk bottlenecks. What if we've checked all that and we're still having problems? Could it be Windows itself?
Windows can definitely have its own quirks,
Yeah.
especially the server versions.
Yeah.
They can affect network performance. For example, the Windows firewall.
So we're disabling firewalls again?
Just for testing, of course.
Of course, of course.
Another thing to check is the power settings for the network adapter.
Oh, within the VM itself.
Make sure it's not set to, like, power saving mode.
Oh, right. It's trying to be helpful.
Yeah, trying to be helpful.
But it's actually slowing us down.
Sabotaging our speed.
Okay, so we've looked at the Proxmox side, the VM side, but we haven't really talked about the fact that virtualization itself adds a little bit of overhead, right?
That's true. Running a VM, it always comes with a small performance cost.
The price we pay for convenience.
Exact.
So even if everything's perfect, there's a tiny little virtualization tax.
You could call it that.
Okay.
But the good news is, usually it's pretty small.
Huh.
And keeping Proxmox and your drivers up to date, that'll really minimize it.
Makes sense. All right, so for our listeners out there, if you're running into slow network speeds with your Windows VM on Proxmox, remember, it could be any number of things.
Don't panic.
Don't panic.
Yeah. Take a deep breath.
Take a deep breath and start working through those potential culprits we've talked about today.
Oftentimes, it's something really simple, like a driver update or a quick tweak to a setting.
Yeah.
The key is to be methodical in your troubleshooting and to understand how all these different pieces fit together.
Right. It's all a big puzzle.
It is.
And we're learning how to solve it.
Absolutely.
Great advice. All right, and that brings us to the end of part 1 of this deep dive. Welcome back. In the first part of this deep dive, we talked about a bunch of stuff like drivers, adapters, resource allocation, even disk performance.
We went through a pretty good checklist of the usual suspects.
We did. But now let's go a little deeper. Let's look at some more advanced techniques for really fine-tuning your virtual network.
Okay, fine-tuning. I like it. Where do you want to start?
Well, this guide mentions something called jumbo frames. And I have to admit, I'm kind of picturing like those big, oversized picture frames you see in museums.
Haha, that's a funny image. But no, in the networking world, jumbo frames are about increasing the maximum size of Ethernet packets.
Okay, so bigger packets. Why is that a good thing?
Well, every packet has some overhead information, right? In addition to the actual data you're sending.
Right, it's like the packaging.
Exactly, it's the packaging. So by using bigger packets, you're reducing that proportion of overhead. More of your bandwidth is actually dedicated to your data.
Ah, so it's like instead of making multiple trips with a small car, you're taking a truckload of goods all at once.
I like that analogy.
Efficient.
It's all about efficiency.
Yeah.
But there's a catch. Jumbo frames need support from every single device in the network path.
Oh, so it's not just the VM.
Nope. Your VM, your host, your switch, router, everything.
Everybody's got to be on board.
Everyone's got to be on the same page, and if they're not, if things are mismatched, it can actually make performance worse.
Oh, wow, so it could backfire.
Yeah, it's not a set it and forget it thing.
Mm-hmm.
So before you even think about enabling jumbo frames, research your hardware.
Right, make sure everything's compatible.
Absolutely. Look at the specs for your network card, your switch, your router, all of that.
Okay, so even if it all looks good, we should probably still test carefully after we make the change, right?
Always a good idea. Start small, small increases to the packet size, see what happens, and monitor your performance.
Right, baby steps. And if we see improvements, then maybe we can increase it further.
Exactly.
But if things get weird, if performance drops, then back it off.
Yeah, go back to the default settings.
All right, so jumbo frames, powerful tool, but use with caution.
Definitely.
Okay, so we're talking network configuration. This guide also mentions TCP segmentation offload, or TSO.
TSO, yes. So this one focuses on optimizing the sending side of your connection.
Okay, so we're sending data from the VM.
Exactly. So normally when your VM sends data, its CPU, it breaks it down into those smaller segments.
Right, to fit in those standard packets.
Yes. So with TSO, we basically offload this to the network card itself.
So the network card does the heavy lifting.
Right, instead of the CPU having to chop everything up.
So the CPU can, relax a little bit, focus on other things.
Exactly, free up those CPU cycles, which can improve overall system performance.
So this sounds like a win-win, but are there any downsides to using TSO?
Well, like most performance tweaks, there can be some trade-offs.
Okay.
Sometimes it can actually slightly increase latency.
Latency, so the delay.
Yeah, especially for smaller data transfers. And if your network card's already under heavy load, maybe this isn't the best thing to do.
Right, it's already working hard enough.
Right. So again, testing is crucial. Make sure you understand the potential downsides before you enable it.
Makes sense. Now, we've talked about optimizing the network itself, but what about the Windows VM running on Proxmox? Can we do anything inside the VM to help with performance?
Oh, definitely. Windows, especially the server versions, they often come with a lot of features and services.
A lot of bloat.
You could say. And a lot of them, you might not even need them.
It's like having a bunch of apps open on your phone, even though you're not using them. Just drains the battery.
Perfect analogy.
So it's like we're decluttering, right? Disabling anything that we don't absolutely need.
That's exactly it. So the first step is to identify those services that aren't essential.
Right.
Things like maybe file sharing,
Okay.
print services, remote desktop, all that stuff. If you're not using it, turn it off.
Shut it down. Yeah. And while we're doing all this cleaning up, we should probably make sure that Windows is fully updated, right?
Always a good idea. Windows updates, they often include performance improvements.
Bug fixes, all that good stuff.
Exactly. Some of those can directly impact network speed and stability.
All right, so keep it updated. Now, while we're talking updates, what about drivers? Specifically for the network adapter, are there any special considerations there?
Even though we already configured the adapter in Proxmox, you should still check the settings within Windows.
Oh, really?
Yeah, sometimes Windows will apply its own defaults that don't quite match up.
Okay, so what are we looking for specifically?
The speed and duplex settings.
Oh, okay, so those might not match what we set in Proxmox.
It happens more often than you'd think. Make sure the speed is set to the highest value that your network connection supports.
Okay.
And the duplex should be set to auto negotiation.
Right, and that's going to ensure that the VM and the network are talking to each other at the fastest possible speed.
Exactly.
We don't want any miscommunication about how fast those bits should be flowing.
Exactly. And while you're in the adapter settings, you might also see options for some more advanced features like TCP offload engine, ToE, or receive side scaling, RSS.
ToE sounds a bit like TSO.
Yeah, you're right. They're related. Both ToE and TSO, they're about offloading tasks from the CPU to the network card.
So the network card can do more of the work.
Right, and then RSS, that's about distributing network traffic across multiple cores.
Okay.
So that's for better efficiency.
So it's all about maximizing how the system handles the network traffic. But didn't you mention earlier that these features, they can sometimes cause problems?
Yeah, they can. If the driver for the network card is outdated or buggy, enabling these features can sometimes backfire, decreased performance, even instability.
So experimentation is key again.
It's all about experimenting, seeing if it helps or hurts in your particular case.
All right, let's switch gears a bit. Talk about a scenario that I think is even more frustrating than confusing. Intermittent Network drops.
Ugh, the disappearing act.
Or worse.
1 minute you're browsing happily, the next, nothing.
It's like playing whack-a-mole with your network connection.
Yeah.
As soon as you think you found the problem, it pops up somewhere else.
That's a great way to put it. So when this happens, first things first, check those physical connections.
Right, back to basics.
Cables plugged in securely, no damage, no obvious interference.
Okay, so cables, making sure nothing's loose or broken. What are some common sources of interference we should look out for?
Well, wireless networks can be a culprit.
Okay.
Microwaves, even fluorescent lights sometimes. They can disrupt those signals. So if possible, try to isolate your server, the VM, from anything that could be causing interference.
So if your Proxmox server is sitting right next to a microwave that's blasting popcorn,
Yeah, maybe rethink that setup.
maybe not the best idea. Okay, so if isolating the server isn't an option, what can we do?
Well, you can try using shielded network cables. Or if you're using Wi-Fi, maybe switch to a wired connection.
Okay, that makes sense. All right, so we've checked physical connections, we've ruled out interference, but the drops keep happening. What else could be causing this?
Sometimes the problem lies in the network infrastructure itself. Switches, routers, even the network cards in your host and your VM.
Okay, so it's like there's a gremlin hiding somewhere in our network gear. How do we track it down?
One way is to just systematically replace components,
Okay,
starting with the easiest ones to swap out.
so for example, if we have a spare network cable, we could try replacing the one connecting the VM to the host.
Exactly. And if that doesn't work, try a different port on the switch.
Right.
Or even replace the switch entirely if you have a spare one.
So we're basically playing detective, eliminating possibilities one by one.
That's right. And usually you'll find the culprit.
Okay, cool. Well, we've covered a lot of troubleshooting ground in this deep dive, from basic ping tests to some pretty advanced analysis.
We've really built up our toolbox for diagnosing and fixing these network performance problems.
We have. And even though these tools and techniques are incredibly useful, the most important thing is your own knowledge.
That's so true. The more you understand about how networks work,
How Proxmox and Windows interact, yeah.
the better equipped you'll be to solve any problem that comes up.
All right, welcome back to the final part of our deep dive,
The grand finale.
the grand finale. We've gone from the basics of drivers and adapters to some pretty advanced stuff like jumbo frames.
We even did some Windows decluttering.
We did. We Marie Kondo'd that VM.
Sparked some network joy.
But now it's time to put it all together and tackle some real-world scenarios where things just aren't working. Imagine this. You've followed all the steps, you've got the right drivers, the adapters are configured, firewall's good, resources are optimized, but your network is still sluggish. Where do you even begin to figure out what's wrong?
So you've checked off all the boxes.
All the boxes are checked.
Time for some detective work.
We got to get out our magnifying glass.
Exactly. And one of the most basic tools we have is the good old ping command.
Ping. So that's like sending out a little signal and seeing if it comes back.
Like a sonar pulse, yeah.
Okay.
So ping lets us test that connectivity and measure the latency.
Latency. So that's the time it takes for the signal to travel.
To go out and come back, yep. And that can tell us a lot about where a bottleneck might be.
So we open up a command prompt in our Windows VM and we ping. What do we ping?
A good target is Google's public DNS server,
Oh yeah, I've heard of that one.
8.8.8.
8.8.8.8. Okay.
Yeah.
Easy to remember. So we ping that, and what are we looking for?
If the pings are working and the times are low, that's good. It means your basic connection from the VM to the outside world, that's working.
Okay, that's a good sign. But what if those pings are really slow or we're getting timeouts?
Then we need to start isolating the problem. So the next step is to try pinging your Proxmox host.
Ah, okay.
If that's working, then the issue is probably within the VM itself or its configuration.
So we're narrowing it down. What if pinging the host is also slow or unreliable?
Then the problem might be on the Proxmox side or even further upstream in your network, like with your router or your internet connection.
So we're really like network detectives here, following the trail of pings.
Following the clues, and ping is just the first clue. Now, if we've determined that it's the VM, Windows has this handy tool called Resource Monitor.
Resource monitor. Okay, what does that do?
It gives you a real-time look at how your VM is using resources.
Right.
You can see CPU usage, memory, disk activity, network traffic.
Oh, cool. So we can see if anything's hogging resources or if there's like any weird spikes in activity.
Exactly. It can really help you uncover some of those hidden issues.
Awesome. Okay, so we've pinged things, we've checked the resource monitor, but let's say we're still stumped. Anything else specific to Windows that we should look at?
Sometimes it's the simplest things that trip us up.
like forgetting to plug it in.
Right. Double check those network adapter settings within Windows.
But we already made sure we're using the VirtIO driver,
Mm.
and we configured everything in Proxmox. What else is there?
Well, remember, Windows can apply its own defaults that might not be what we want.
Oh, right, those pesky defaults.
Also, check the speed and duplex settings again.
Make sure they match what we set in Proxmox.
Exactly. Speed should be the highest supported value. Duplex should be set to auto negotiation. Just make sure everything's talking at the right speed.
Right. No miscommunication.
Yeah.
Now, while we're in those adapter settings, I think you mentioned before, we might see options for things like TOE or RSS.
You have a good memory. Those can be useful, but remember, they can also cause problems if the driver isn't working properly, so experiment with those cautiously.
Got it. Let's talk about one more scenario. Intermittent network drops. This is a frustrating one.
Ugh, the disappearing act.
It's like playing whack-a-mole with your network connection.
So annoying. First thing to check is the physical connections.
Always back to basics?
Make sure cables are secure, no damage, no interference.
Okay, so no loose cables or anything like that.
Yeah.
What are some things that can cause interference?
Wireless networks can be a culprit. Microwaves, believe it or not, even fluorescent lights can sometimes mess with the signals.
So keep your server away from the kitchen.
It's probably a good idea. If you can't isolate it completely, maybe try shielded cables or switching to a wired connection if you're on Wi-Fi.
Okay, good tips. So we've checked the physical connections, ruled out interference, but the drops are still happening. What's next?
Sometimes the problem is in the network gear itself. The switches, routers, even the network cards.
So one of those is acting up. How do we figure out which one it is?
Try replacing components systematically. Start with the easiest ones to swap.
So if you have a spare network cable, try that first.
Exactly. Then maybe a different port on the switch. If you have a spare switch, try that. They'll usually be able to narrow it down.
It's all about elimination. All right, well, I think we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
We've explored a whole bunch of tools and techniques to diagnose and fix those network issues.
And even though we've focused on Proxmox and Windows VMs today, a lot of these principles apply to other setups too.
Troubleshooting is troubleshooting. The key is to understand the basics and then build on that knowledge.
And don't be afraid to experiment.
Exactly. Experiment, learn, and don't give up. You'll get those networks running smoothly.
And with that, we've reached the end of our deep dive into Proxmox network performance. Thanks for joining us.